back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington, and joining us again from Amherst, Massachusetts is Ilene Grabel. She's a professor of international finance at the University of Denver. She joins us from the Perry Institute in Amherst, and she blogs at triplecrisis.com. Thanks for joining us again, Ilene.
You're welcome.
So one of the big things that the IMF has done over the years, and World Bank, is vigorously opposed any state that wants to control the flow of capital. So whether that's capital flight, people taking their money out, or putting some kind of conditions and restrictions on where capital can go, especially foreign investment. That's been one of the pillars of this thing called neoliberal economics. But you're suggesting there's some conversation in the IMF that might change this.
Yes, that's right. And that's been really, really exciting. And there are lots of different ways in which we could see the IMF wrestling with this issue of capital controls, which the fund has seen really as an anathema for much of the neoliberal period. But we know that with the standby agreement that the fund signed with Iceland at the very beginning of the global crisis, Iceland had already put in place some very stringent capital controls prior to its involvement with the fund, but then the Icelandic standby arrangement with the IMF actually contained some very explicit language about the need to maintain these capital controls. And that was a really important decision on the part of the fund, because it was one of the first times in recent decades that the fund has actually made a case for the necessity of capital controls in the context of an economy that was unraveling. And so that was a very important sign for us that the IMF was starting to think about the issue of capital controls in a much more nuanced and open-minded way.
Well, is it partly, and you can see it in some of the conversation that goes on in Washington, that a lot of the people that seemed supposedly to understand the global economy turned out not to really understand it? That when you hear them talking, they don't really seem to know where they are in this crisis, and all the policy seems kind of up in the air.
That's right, it does. I think that the fund and the economics profession was taken by surprise. Of course, as progressive economists have been predicting these kinds of problems for a long time, but the core of the profession and the official Washington, the Bretton Woods institutions, these were folks that seemed to be completely caught off guard. And what we've been seeing in the context of this unraveling crisis is a kind of ad hoc, on-the-ground response. The fund has continually been surprised by the places in the world where new crises are popping up, and it's been really scrambling to try to respond to the crisis. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing some signs of rethinking at least certain aspects of the fund's responses to crisis, because the severity of the crisis, its spread, has really taken the profession, the mainstream of the profession, by surprise, and it's caused what seems to be rethinking, at least in some dimensions. And I think the capital control issue is one of the most important things for us to watch as progressive economists.
I mean, I think one of the things, so that it becomes real for people, this neoliberal period essentially gave rise to a massive shift of wealth from the poorer countries and poorer people within the advanced countries to the 1 or 2 top percentile. And of course, I think most people know that in the midst of this crisis, the situation in the less developed countries is far worse in terms of unemployment and increased poverty. But why does what the IMF does now, why does that matter to ordinary people in North America?
In North America, there's of course been a big backlash against the kinds of assistance packages that have been granted to the very bankers and financial institutions that caused the crisis. And I think given the way in which the IMF has responded to the crisis and the U.S. has scaled up its financial commitments to the fund, it means that taxpayers and ordinary people in wealthy countries are now concerned about whether or not the IMF, as the kind of guardian of the global financial system, failed to see the signs of the crisis, and there is concern about whether or not the resources that have been committed to the institution are being used to really promulgate the same old kinds of policies and to prop up the same kinds of institutions like the credit rating agencies. They're all part of the landscape that helped to contribute to the crisis.
Perhaps the other thing that's important, which I don't think gets talked about nearly enough, is as countries like Greece and other countries throughout the world are forced to cut back on social spending, reduce pensions, raise the ages of pensions, and especially a whole slew of policies that wind up leading to lower wages. This puts even more wage pressure on workers in North America, where they're competing against even cheaper skilled labor all over the world, and leads to more a downward push on the whole standard of living in North America. It doesn't get talked about very much.
Yeah, it doesn't get talked about much, and we know that with some of the recent downgrades of Mediterranean countries' debt that was kind of triggered by the crisis in Greece, which we have at least reason to believe is going to spread to other Mediterranean European countries. Even the U.S. stock market responded to that crisis. There was a big drop in U.S. stock prices as a consequence of worries about the crisis in the Mediterranean countries. And that matters to ordinary people, not so much because they have stock portfolios that may be affected by the decline of U.S. stock prices, but when U.S. corporations start to lose funds, they may start to cut back on employment, and there are possible effects on unemployment in the U.S., as you noted. So it is something which does matter to ordinary people.
So the G20 a year ago created this fund to reinvigorate the IMF, and the G20 is going to meet again in Toronto in June. The IMF has some proposals they're going to take to the G20. What's interesting there?
The IMF issued an interim report to the G20 in conjunction with the spring IMF World Bank meetings, and that report, incidentally, was kind of leaked to the BBC and has received a lot of attention in the global business press. And the two things that were most interesting about this interim report was that it contained proposals for two kinds of taxes on banks. One, a flat tax on banks, and the other is a tax on bank profits and compensation in financial institutions. So it's a kind of two-tier tax on banks that has really made the global banking community very, very nervous. And the G20 at its meetings this coming June 2010 in Toronto is going to be taking up those proposals. And at least early press reports indicate that some G20 country representatives are supportive of these proposals, and some are very strongly opposed to them. The Canadian representative, for instance, has expressed a lot of concern about these proposals. And of course, the global banking lobby has already begun to try to discredit these proposals. And they were frankly surprising that they came from the
What do they want to do with the money they get from this tax?
They want to set that money aside as a kind of rainy day fund that could provide resources should there be another financial crisis. So it would be a fund that banks would pay into in good times, that would provide resources to bail out banks in bad times.
Well, there's been some discussion of that in the United States. The big banks are sitting on, I think it's over $800 billion of reserves that essentially were handed them for free by the Fed. And there's some talk about whether any of that's going to be taxed back. I don't know how far these IMF proposals are going to get in the United States.
Yeah, the U.S. administration has spoken cautiously in favor of these IMF proposals because, as you note, they're consistent with some of the proposals that had already been articulated in the U.S. Whether or not the U.S. banking industry, which we know is, of course, incredibly powerful, is going to lobby successfully against them is, of course, another matter. It wouldn't be surprising if they're able to deep six these proposals.
Oh, that would be a great, great surprise if the banks weren't successful.
Yes, it would be.
I think we're going to see a little more public whipping of Goldman Sachs, and then more likely back to business as usual. Thanks very much for joining us, Ilene.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.